in India. Without further ado, let me go to the first presentation. The first presentation will be by Smita with the topic Digital Entrepreneurship and Adoption in the Context of Social Distancing and Economic Recovery. Smita?
Thank you very much, Ganesh, and good morning to everybody. Let me start with the next slide, please. In terms of the crisis, we are looking at an unprecedented crisis today, which has had ripple effects due to various channels. The four main channels can be broken down as the lockdown effect, the demand shocks, the supply shocks, and the financial shocks. And finally, the uncertainty that is driving lack of business and investment sentiments. Now, next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. So in terms of the global economic fallout, this has been both a health as well as an economic crisis. Now, this has gotten into a global recession, and there has been various predictions, mainly being that trade is going to be declining and at par with what we saw in the global financial crisis, and with global FDI expected to drop by as much as 40% in 2020. We also see sharp drops in manufacturing and services activities. And here I'd like to highlight one specific aberration though. Looking at the China data, you can actually see that e-commerce actually did pick up during the COVID crisis. So this is going to be kind of the crux of my presentation today. Next slide, please. So looking at big data, one can see how do you implement looking at big data, how do you see some of these changes? We can see, for example, in Malaysia, when the MCO was implemented, there was a sharp decline in activity in terms of workplace, as well as in retail and recreation. The same we could see in other countries in the region, such as Myanmar, as well as in tourist destinations like Bali, where there was an unprecedented decrease in activity in recreations, as well as in flights. Next slide, please. So for Malaysia, this crisis comes with an added decline that we saw in the third quarter of 2019, where there was already a decline due to commodity and a decline in net investments. Now, the World Bank forecasts have been there's been a decline in the predictions, which is now going to be at minus 0.1. But however, there's going to be another update, which is going to be coming out in the next few weeks with our latest predictions. Next slide. So as I had highlighted in the first slide, the one thing that we actually do see an increase in is e-commerce. So what MCOs and lockdowns imply is that economic activities that earlier used to require close physical contact have now been really severely restricted. Now, what does that mean? That e-commerce has become an emerging major pillar in the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, analytical data from China has shown that SMEs in particular, which are going to be the most hard hit, actually were able to survive better were those who are digitally connected. They also had greater access to finance. So e-commerce can, given that this is going to be a medium to long-term effect, where physical social distancing will be a requirement, e-commerce can actually further reduce the risk of job losses by making sure that certain services remain open. For example, many brick and mortar shops have been forced to move online. Customers are now much more willing to adopt online shopping and to experiment with new services. By offering online grocery service, for example, supermarkets can help customers avoid in-store visits. Online payments can obviate the need for in-cash transactions. E-commerce can thus help preserve jobs because restaurants that could not accommodate in-venue dining could actually resort to offering online takeout services. And finally, e-commerce can actually help increase the acceptance of prolonged physical distancing measures among the population, which will be required. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. What is the role of policymakers here? Here, it is very important to make sure that there's always close public-private dialogue with when businesses resume activity. For example, when we look at the case of Malaysia, clear guidelines and SOPs communicated using various means, which will be online, newspapers, radio, whatever be the means. We also need to ensure that the government provides an enabling environment for e-commerce, ensuring basic infrastructure capabilities, something that my colleague Siddharth will talk about, but also logistics services and systems to facilitate this increased digitization. And here again, we could learn from MDEC's experience in the digital free trade zone. And finally, and most importantly, support businesses to adopt digital payments. Next slide, please. All of this requires ensuring a regulatory framework that is simple and transparent, which are key to digitization and include the elements of financial security, where consumers need to feel secure when they get online. There needs to be confidence both among firms as well as consumers who would have to embrace digital platforms and payments as a way of conducting business, which means that there needs to be added vigilance in terms of cybersecurity, data protection, and other means of consumer protection, wherein there can be redressal, for example, if there's a fraudulent activity on a consumer's credit card, just as an example. Next slide, please. So here again, what is required is a really public-private partnerships become very key here. There needs to be a close dialogue with the private sector constantly to identify the most pressing needs, especially when it comes to SMEs. Take advantage of existing SME programs. There's a course correction that could be then facilitated when there is this close partnership between the public and the private sector, where the feedback from the private sector could actually inform agile policy making from the government side. Regulatory simplification and transparency, as I said, are key. But in terms of SMEs, increasing awareness among them, sensitizing them on the advantages of going digital, as well as capacity building, which requires reskilling and upskilling for firms, especially SMEs, becomes very pivotal. So next slide. So in sum, basically, I would like to underline the fact that while there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with the crisis, what we can say with some degree of certainty is that digitization will play an ever more increasing role during the crisis as well as post-recovery. This implies that governments should use the crisis as an opportunity to expedite reforms to ensure regulatory simplification, transparency, which are key to digitization, as well as address the needs to support capacity building, upskilling of firms, as well as awareness raising, both amongst SMEs and consumers. So I'll stop here and I'll have any questions in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Ganesh, you're muted. Sorry.
Digitalization will play a further increasing role in the post-COVID economy or the post-COVID world. It's all about e-commerce. E-commerce will play a big role in terms of saving jobs. Public-private partnership is the way to go in terms of capacity development, which is important in the post-COVID world, especially when it comes to e-commerce and digitalization. We need to facilitate digital payments to further enable a social distancing world. as well as we need to make sure that governments need to ensure that there's a proper regulatory environment to also ensure that everything is in place in a further digitalized world post COVID. Now, we talked about, as Smita touched a bit about infrastructure. Now let's look at the state of infrastructure in Malaysia. So we'll pass over the screen to Siddhartha. We'll talk about a bit about digital connectivity at the time of COVID-19, and we'll cover topics such as digital access, literacy, and bridging the urban-rural divide. Siddhartha?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for introducing me, Ganesh, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm hoping that at the end of my brief presentation, you will have a few ideas about the kinds of conversations that are happening around the world in terms of what could be done both to respond immediately to this crisis that we're all facing together. And on the other hand, also, as Smita very nicely put it, that there is an opportunity in every crisis. What could be things that are put in place? What could be ideas or measures that governments could consider, maybe the private sector could consider, that actually also prepare us for the unfortunate reality that we may also face similar situations in the future, whether it's due to climate-related crises or man-made or natural disasters, etc. And so there's certainly something that this shock may teach us in terms of preparing for those earlier, what we used to think were unanticipated or unexpected events. And so I'm hoping that at the end of my presentation, you'll have a few ideas and get a sense of the conversations that are happening around the world. Please go to the next slide. And as Smita's already mentioned this, so I don't really want to spend too much time on this, but just to say a few key points is that as we're all realizing, and in fact, this webinar is a testament to this reality, we're really facing now the reality that we're all having to transact, interact, and work increasingly in a digital manner. Now, this, of course, is for people who are connected, something of a transition in itself. And we're all realizing that it has implications for our social lives and, of course, in some ways for our economic lives as well. But there's also the large percentage of the population in many countries around the world which are unconnected. And even in places where there is access to the internet, where the quality is not good enough, or where the prices are so high or high enough that a lot of people are not able to afford internet access or the devices that they would need to engage in a meaningful way in the online environment. Now, this transcends individuals, it's about businesses, it's about governments, in terms of the fact that not everybody is in a position to digitize and to really take on this new way of working. It includes a large percentage of the population, which are, as you know, in Malaysia, you refer to them as the bottom 40% in terms of wealth distribution. It includes rural populations. It includes, in many cases, women or minorities that may not have access to technology, even in a regular fashion. And so, obviously, with this crisis, those kinds of divisions have become even more stark and have become even more challenging. There are countries that I've been working in where there's a lot of discussion about, for example, the move to online education, where there's children who are in the cities or the children who are in wealthier families able to afford or already have computers or have internet connections which can sustain online learning. But so many of them in rural areas or so many of them who are below the poverty line, the students are not able to really get into the online learning environment, and in some cases don't even have access to the technology to start that process. So on the one hand, it means that we have this immediate challenge, and any design that we undertake, any intervention that we undertake needs to be sensitive to that reality. But on the other hand, it really makes us think about the fact that countries that are less prepared, businesses that are less prepared, households that are less prepared are going to face an increasing digital divide and its consequences, and we really have to think quite a bit about that. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So what are the challenges that we have seen around the world so far? And I'll also mention a little bit about Malaysia in this context. Certainly, as I've already mentioned before, that there's lots of parts of the world where broadband connectivity is not available. And I do want to say here that it's oftentimes been convenient in the past to talk about broadband connectivity as internet speeds of as low as 256 kilobytes a second, which in some places is still the official definition. As you can probably imagine, that's almost ridiculous in this conversation to think about sustaining online learning or telehealth for non-emergency situations, or even accessing government services on anything less than a few megabits per second in terms of connectivity speeds. And so certainly one of the questions that is arising in a lot of places is about how do we actually increase access to high-speed broadband connectivity, and to make sure that in the places where there is connectivity, that networks remain functional, quality of services not undermined, that also those services are affordable. And as I mentioned before, that there's also the sort of challenge where you have a lot of people who may be in network coverage but are unable to afford devices or unable to afford services. And of course, there's, as I mentioned earlier, the urban-rural divide and the maybe different kinds of social demographic divides that also need to be considered in that. So it becomes very complex, where you have even a city that may be, for example, as well connected as Kuala Lumpur, and that urban area, you may have people who are not fully connected, not able to take advantage of those kinds of services. So we do have to think about that aspect as well. Now, apart from the infrastructure aspects to this, there's a few other pieces, and in fact, Smita's presentation also touched upon these. So I'll mention them briefly, but just to give them the right importance. Cybersecurity is going to become even more critical. And unfortunately, even though we are facing this pandemic together, there's been an increase in cyber attacks, for example, on health systems. We've seen hospitals, for example, or some health databases receiving these kinds of cyber attacks at a higher frequency for various reasons. I can't speculate to that, but to certainly say that kind of improvement in cybersecurity capability, especially as businesses and as individuals who may not have been as digitally active and transacting online, are doing that now, as governments are thinking of delivering more of their public services online now, that they do need to think about making sure that those systems and those transactions are secure. Related to this is, of course, the question of identification, something where you need to have the right kind of ID so that people can transact, they can undertake the financial transactions that they need, but also in some cases where you have benefit transfers or you have programs which are delivered digitally, and where you don't have the right kind of identification systems, and obviously that can create leakage in those systems and mistargeted allocations of benefits and such, or in some cases benefits being denied. Similarly, with digital financial services, where you have, again, a lot of underdeveloped systems, and you have a lot of cases now where there's a rapid rush to think about how there might be moves towards allowing transactions that in some cases may not have been permitted before. So there's a bunch of countries, for example, where the limits to individual transactions were very low. You could only have very small value transactions, but now that has to be increased as businesses and individuals are trying to shift to an online mode of working. And finally, as I've also hinted at earlier, that even if all these things are in place, there will be a significant part of the population that doesn't have the capability, either because they lack in skills, they lack in awareness, they don't understand, or they are not aware of where the services are available and how to use them. So it's both, it's a pre-existing condition, so to speak. But in this situation where it's also difficult to mobilize training, it's difficult to send someone into people's homes to actually train them and teach them. It actually creates an additional barrier. So the limited user capabilities, the first chance we get, I think one of the things that needs to be done is to make sure that we somehow enable a building up of skills and capacity. Now, where does Malaysia stand in this situation? Let me maybe hint at a few data points that I have available to me. This is based on some international resources that we have available here. To say that, for example, on the very pure infrastructure side, the number of percentage of households which has fiber optic connectivity and is subscribing to a fiber optic fiber optic based internet service is about 15%. In Malaysia. Now, this is out of approximately 40 countries across Asia Pacific. Malaysia is right in the middle. It's at rank 20 out of 40. So what this means is that there is some infrastructure out there. And really, if you start thinking about high-speed connectivity at speeds of 100 megabits per second or above, you're obviously thinking about fiber optic connectivity to the home, especially when you have maybe kids and the parents and others streaming video, interacting with colleagues online, doing their emails, all of those things, where it increases the capacity requirements as well. So certainly the bandwidth requirements are such that we do need to see greater levels of investment in this high-end infrastructure that will actually connect more people to higher quality, more reliable bandwidth. Now, on the other hand, in terms of affordability, Malaysia actually does quite well when it comes to the affordability of more basic internet services, and also in terms of the coverage and use of basic internet services. So you're already at quite a good position there. But then again, when you talk about higher end services and you're talking about higher speed broadband connectivity, affordability does become a challenge, especially for poorer parts of the population. And there have been significant reductions in prices over the last 2 years. Some of the policy and regulatory reforms that have been undertaken by the government have helped a lot in that. But there's certainly scope to do more. There's certainly scope to use the existing infrastructure that's in the country to a greater extent. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those measures. Thank you. So I like to think of this response in terms of 3 R's, the immediate relief, the slightly longer term or medium term recovery, and then in the longer term, a resilience effort that we need to take to prepare for the future. And I'll let you all look at this slide, and I'll just highlight a few key points that I'd like to mention. So in terms of the relief, now obviously with the situation we're facing already today, it's difficult to talk about adding more infrastructure or adding more equipment into or capital expenditures into the system at this point. But what is certainly possible is to open up existing internet infrastructure, which is existing in a country like Malaysia, which has already invested a significant amount, for example, in fiber optic backbone connectivity. It's possible to use that. There's alternative infrastructure, for example, that the electrical transmission company also has that can also be used to a greater effect. And so there's existing infrastructure, there's existing radio spectrum, which allows wireless communications to happen, to open more of those bands up in short term, allowing companies to deliver higher quality services, get people connected. Now, these are shorter term measures, and in the longer term, however, that's where you really need to start thinking about the capital expenditures that would need to be put in place, the investments that need to be put in place. Smita has already referred to public-private partnerships, which is a great way to go to mobilize financing and catalyze private investment, especially again in those rural and remote areas where the business case alone may not be viable as a standalone, but with some support from the government, with some aid from the state, that it's possible to overcome those gaps and move things forward. And certainly the whole question of digital capabilities for small businesses, especially, we often see that while larger organizations are able to invest more, smaller businesses are the ones who lag in terms of investing in digital capabilities and technology. And so certainly thinking about ways to do that. Now, here's again a place where on both the capability side and on investments on the small business side, Malaysia has already been doing a lot, especially programs of MDEC over the last few years have targeted the bottom 40 population, helping them work online, helping businesses and e-commerce to really get active. And I think that continuing that, expanding that, and trying to identify what now new maybe divides have been exposed by this current crisis could be overcome as well. And so certainly then looking at the longer term cybersecurity related investments and trying to really sustain those longer term enabling investments in skills and infrastructure can help also prepare for the future. And unfortunately, as I said, the inevitable realization that I think we all have, which is that if this has happened once, it's now something that has to factor into our business plans and our work plans for the future as well, as something that can happen again in the future. But to end on a positive note, I think one of the things that we've definitely seen in terms of a global sort of move is that there is now an expanded realization of the opportunity of digital with people who were otherwise trying to resist it. And if anything, a country like Malaysia that has already made investments and has already tried to position itself to be competitive in the global digital economy, I think this is again a good opportunity. There's probably a few things that need to be done to make it a real game changer for the country. But certainly the momentum is in place, and if anything, this crisis should be turned into an opportunity and set the stage for a future digital era that will really be more inclusive and will truly allow people to expand their capabilities into the future. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions again as we get to that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddhartha. Just a bit of a summary of the points Siddhartha brought up. Key challenges we are facing in digital economy. Infrastructure looks like it appears to be one of the biggest key challenges. Broadband reach and access is a challenge. Network congestion now with everybody actually going online is another challenge. Of course, capacity development or capability development, in particular among the B40, is another challenge. But the good news, of course, is that I think Malaysia, based on its previous initiatives, have actually already looked at some of these, in particular initiatives from MDEC. They have actually looked at improving the digital divide, especially among the B40. And of course, governments have a greater role to play, especially in terms of promoting digital transactions. Now, with that, let us pass over to Surina, who'll talk a bit about advancing the nation as Malaysia's digital economy investment specialist on behalf of MDEC. Surina?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, yes. Fantastic. So it's I'm super happy to be here this morning. Thank you very much, Smita and Sid, for setting the stage and the context. I think those themes are themes that we've been hearing, not just hearing, but experiencing directly over the last 3 weeks. Certainly for all of us here in Malaysia, that's been in a movement control order for I think we are in week 13 now. So to echo on some of the themes that's been discussed so far, we are really in a very, you can choose your word. Some would say interesting, some use the word exciting. I choose the word exciting juncture because it really is. What we've gone through so far has been unprecedented. It is a global pandemic. On top of an environment where there was already a lot of change that was happening from a technology, from a digital standpoint. But the good news, I'm just gonna, for my remarks, I'll just summarize some of the themes that we're seeing. So what we heard just now is digital has been an enabler. We've seen digital as an enabler in this globally during this pandemic, and certainly as we continue to move forward, it is going to be a key driver. E-commerce, for one, has seen a significant increase in activity, and the other big theme that we've seen also is the fact that now we live in at MDEC, we call it digital by default, because what is digital at the end of the day? Digital is all about being able to connect with one another via using technology means. It's being able to improve processes by using technology means. And so it really is enabler. So I think Sid touched on it just now. I think one of the wonderful side effects of COVID-19 is the fact that from a consumer standpoint, there's been a significant increase in confidence as far as adopting digital is concerned, and that's where we are. And so before, when we were talking about digital technologies, digital adoption, there was always a question of if, and there was always a question of why. Now it's really a question of how. I think we're all consumers, government, businesses embracing the fact that we all need to embrace digital. So it really is a question of how. So on our side, from a developmental standpoint, we have been working very closely with industry to help develop the digital industry. And then now it's all about, the question then becomes, how do we accelerate this, and so that we can continue to advance Malaysia's digital economy? And Sumita touched on it right on the head. The only way for us to accelerate this is to accelerate private and public partnerships, because that's how we can actually drive impact at scale. So over the last 2-3 months, for example, there has been a significant increase in collaboration. There has been a significant increase in dialogue, actually. So public sector, private sector, and even dialogue amongst private sector itself. Conversation and dialogue has been happening to further increase collaboration so that we can drive impact at scale by having private and public partnerships. So if you've been on social media, for example, you will notice that over the last 2 months in particular, government has been having a lot of consultation sessions and getting input directly from private sector in terms of, what can we do, what should we do, what should we reform, what policies can we adopt to continue to move ourselves forward. And you'll also see that at the highest level of government, we've got the EAC, and which is an advisory council, which started out as an advisory council. Now it's more almost like a decision council, and that has significant private sector representation. So the spirit of private-public partnership is certainly something that we all realize that, and we are taking full heart. So how do we continue to accelerate is the question now. And one way to do that, it's accelerating your discourse, accelerating private and public sector partnerships. The other theme that we're seeing also is increasing capabilities. And so Sid touched on that as well. And so how do we continue to impart knowledge, for example, on adopting e-commerce? And how do we do that at scale? So the good news coming out of COVID-19 is the fact that now, the whole world has done, it's probably the largest experiment on how do you work online. And so what we've seen is now everybody has been adopting this whole remote working way, and are really adapting to having meetings online and working online. And the exciting thing about that is that it's the ability to impart knowledge and build capabilities at scale. And so I draw this as an example because when we talk about e-commerce, so certainly one of the things that MDEC has been doing over the years is building capabilities as far as e-commerce is concerned, like training, development, and so forth and so forth. And in the past, these programs that we've done, the training that we've done, has largely been in person. But thanks to COVID, we've pivoted and taken all our content online. And in fact, just last month, a month or so ago, we held our very first online, we call it e-dagang, so e-commerce expo, and that was a week worth of programming to bring the private sector. We had some of the best speakers from the industry to share and impart knowledge in terms of how you actually go online. And in that week alone, when we had over 5,000 live in-class participants that participated live in class, in addition to over 60,000 participants that were following online. And that's something that was just done in 1 week. So think about the potential to scale from there on. And what we also found was when we surveyed the participants, which was spread across, it's not just like existing large businesses, 80% of the participants were from SMEs and micro SMEs, so companies with less than 30 employees. And what we found when we polled was that 99% said that the knowledge that they received via, using the online medium was, they rated it good to excellent in comparison to a live class. So that statistic is super encouraging, and which means that we have the ability to continue to build capabilities at speed and scale. So this is an example I share because we talked about the issue at hand really is how do you build capabilities, how do you adopt digital? So to adopt digital, you need to learn how, and to learn how you need to, we need to be able to do that at scale. And so that's just one example. So as we think about digital economy post-COVID and what we need to do, I gave a presentation to the EAC about 6 weeks ago, and about accelerating digital economy post-COVID. And some of the points that I made back then in my presentation was the fact that today we live in a system with a lot that's interconnected. So in order to advance, you really need to make sure that you develop not just infrastructure, but you also need to, which is really important, but you also need to develop applications and services that touch businesses, because you need digitally empowered businesses. You need a digital government. You also need like digitally savvy society. So it's all interconnected, and really what we need to do, and this applies not only just at the government level, but to individual company level as well. We really need to take a step back and examine the system as a whole, but at the same time, really understand what quick wins are, because you need to execute and find quick wins, and also what longer term reforms you need to make. And that's certainly the approach that the government is taking right now. So Sid, I love that you said, you mentioned 3 R's as your last slide. And so I'm happy to share with you that as it relates to the approach to COVID-19, the government's approach is actually 6 R. And so not 3 R's, but 6 R. So the 6 R's being resolve. So at the beginning of it, we really resolved to contain COVID-19. And so therefore we had the movement control order and information on really resolved to contain that. Resilience, so 260 billion worth of stimulus to help provide resilience so that businesses can continue, people who can continue. And the third R really is restart. It's all about restarting the economy. And so we're 3 weeks into a restricted movement control order. And in fact, tomorrow, we should be hearing from the government in terms of what the restart and economic recovery plan is. And what you'll probably hear in there, because we've been doing lots of consultations directly with leadership, with the government, and industry also. I know, for example, e-commerce, there's been lots of conversation with the ministries. We expect to hear more digital themes in the restart, the recovery plan. And the other 3 R's, just for the reference, would be recovery. So we need to, in addition to restarting, you need to think about recovery. Revitalizing, so how do you continue to infuse innovation and momentum, and finally reforms. So that's the high level big picture as it relates to where we are right now and how we're thinking and some of the considerations that we have in mind. So I pass it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Serena. We're definitely living in unprecedented and exciting times in inverted commerce. We've seen a significant increase in e-commerce activity. It's now digital by default. It's no longer an option. It's by default. And of course, the Malaysian government through MDEC has been looking at accelerating public-private partnerships with increased collaboration that goes right up to the highest level of government, in particular through our Economic Action Council. And Malaysia is not just looking about infrastructure and connectivity, but also applications, in particular government applications as well. And we're taking it one step further from the 3 R's proposed from the World Bank. We're doing 6 R's, just so that we'll excel even further than the world standards. Now, from an industry perspective, we've definitely gone through, again, very unprecedented times. Just to share with you some statistics that the industry has seen. E-commerce has actually increased, e-commerce volumes has actually increased by about 2 to 3 times over the last 3 months. Instead of growing 60% a year, we're actually growing 200 to 300% over 3 months. So that's an amazing increase in terms of volume. But at the same time, although we're able to cater for the additional customer base on an online perspective, because e-commerce sites and websites can increase their capacity by just switching a button on their Amazon Web Services, the logistic infrastructure and the fulfillment infrastructure have not been able to cope up as quickly as that, because they need to buy trucks. They can't just switch on a truck. So that's an issue that I think we really need to look at in resolving as well. So although volumes have gone up 2 to 3 times, in tandem with that, delivery times may also have gone up 2 to 3 times as well. So I think that's a challenge that I think, just echoing what Siddhartha says, connectivity, and it's not just about digital connectivity, it's also about digital it's also about logistic infrastructure actually has to also play a bigger role now. And with that, let's go to the Q&A session. We've got a few Q&As for the speakers. Now, how would businesses and governments adjust during this post-pandemic era, you believe, Smita?
So the governments have been, there are 3 things that the governments have needed to do. They need to be very agile, be very quick. So in the first phase, all reforms needed to be rapid. So, and the third thing needed to be that there needed to be a close coordination in terms of hearing back from the private sector. So there's governments needing to be agile, being rapid, as well as getting feedback from the private sector. On the private sector side, as Surina nicely pointed out, they've had to embrace digitization, and they've had to also pivot. So in order to be able to survive the crisis, many businesses have had to reshape what they were doing into making it A, digital, and B, more crisis focused. So that brings us to needing firms to be actually more resilient going forward. So building their capabilities so that they are able to be more innovative and more resilient, as these crises, as Siddharth mentioned, are not going to be a one-time affair. It can happen again. So we need to have governments that are agile and private sector equally agile, but able to be innovative and pivot to new business models.
Yeah. So can I add to that? You see, sometimes so some of these things we've heard about before. So for example, when you talk about business continuity, every company has got a business continuity plan, but in the past, it's always been in PowerPoint. So the plans look amazing in PowerPoint. And then you realize, oh no, now it's actually for real. And so for one, as we think about businesses, it's really shifting from this mindset that, you got to just do it and be open to trying. So I think as we think about where we are today, we're 3 months into this new world order. And so I think now we're at the stage where we realize, wow, trying to work online wasn't, there was so much resistance before. Now it's really not that bad. In fact, it's actually pretty good. I kind of like it. And so this sort of thinking, being open to trying, is what businesses needs to continue to embrace. Sometimes we use the word, we say we need to adopt, we need to pivot, we need to transform. Though it sounds like very big. Oh, I don't know how to adopt. I don't know. But what we've learned in COVID is the fact that it's continuously learning and trying. And so in all sides, when we think about adoption, it's really all about trying. We need to increase our ability and receptiveness to just trying. So it's trying a new thing, trying a new way, and so this muscle is really needed. Like even e-commerce, we've seen a lot of people. The reason why we've seen multiple time increases because now people are trying for the first time, and when they try it, they like it, and so there's a lot of opportunity in that. I'll also comment. What we're starting to see also is companies, primarily startups, responding to addressing some of the challenges. So they're providing some of the innovation. So for example, one trend that we saw over in the MCO is the increase in delivery platforms. And so before everybody would really just hear of Grab, for example, and now there are other independent ones that have come up as well. So startups are stepping in to help fill in some of the gaps.
Sure, that's great. Siddhartha, do you have anything to add?
Well, maybe I would add a short sort of example, and this also relates to a question that I see has been posed by one of the participants in terms of how network congestion issues or network availability issues have been addressed in the short term. And I was also just, as you can imagine, and us working at the World Bank, we've actually been a bit on the overdrive mode in terms of the response to the COVID crisis, because there's obviously the public health crisis, there's the macroeconomic crisis, and then there's obviously the repercussions of that in terms of the overall economic effects, as you've already heard from Smita. So we're looking across the world to try to also see what are good practices that have been followed and what are great examples that we can share with others. And maybe just to give you one instance from the United States, actually, which is, I find this quite an interesting way of thinking about a quick reaction from the government, keeping with the theme of agility, for example, to hear some of the concerns from the private sector and respond to that. So there's this program called the Keep Americans Connected Pledge, which was something that was set up by the Federal Communications Commission, which is the American telecommunications regulator, telecoms and broadcasting. And what they really did was work with the private sector to figure out what could be these quick responses. And as I'm reading off here, that they wanted to waive some of the fees that are charged to subscribers, so they have bring down the bill. They also wanted companies to open up Wi-Fi hotspots, which may be closed or available only to subscribers for Wi-Fi services, so that people can use them. And at least the numbers I have here say that about 100 companies across the country signed up to that pledge. So it wasn't mandatory, but companies also responded, recognizing the seriousness of the situation and also the role that connectivity would play. And maybe just the second part to that is in terms of also regulatory intervention, where radio frequencies were allowed for additional radio frequencies were opened up for use by mobile companies so that they could carry the extra load that would obviously be generated, and which we've seen has been generated across different user groups. So just a few examples where, to echo the point that Smita made, I think one of the most critical pieces that we're seeing across the board is really places where things seem to be working a bit better, are places where there is a collaboration, there's a conversation that's happening. And the private sector, the public sector, citizens are talking to each other, sharing information. Obviously, the internet plays a big role in that as well. But really, that kind of the very simple, in the end, human interactions that are helping sort out these complex situations. So, back to you, Ganesh.
Sure. Now again, this is to Siddhartha. Maybe you can take this question followed by Smita. How do we, Malaysia, in terms of our digital economy, compare with our peers in ASEAN?
Yeah, I'll actually certainly direct anyone who is interested in this to the various reports that the World Bank has been putting together over the last few years on various aspects of the digital economy, and they should give you a much more detailed sense of where things are. And maybe I could just speak very briefly to the more on the infrastructure side of the story, and I'll hand it over to Smita to expand on some of the other parts of the story as well. Just to say that, again, in terms of basic connectivity, in fact, Malaysia performs very well. If you look at just plain internet use, without looking at how fast the internet connections are, what quality they are, Malaysia actually does very well compared to its income group. I don't remember the numbers for the ASEAN, but I would imagine that they're also very strong compared to the ASEAN region, or at least at the highest levels compared to the ASEAN region. But when you start going towards higher capacity networks and you start looking at higher speed networks, Malaysia has lagged behind a lot of the other countries in the region. Now, on the one hand, it's a bit of a tough crowd, tough competition, because you do have countries like South Korea or Japan or Singapore that have been, of course, investing a lot and have been considered as world leaders in a lot of the broadband connectivity space for a long time. But Malaysia has been catching up, and that's the good news here. Now, what needs to really happen is the next stage is investments, as I've mentioned earlier, to really push networks out into rural parts of the country, into those parts of the country where a purely commercial case may not exist, and so we need to do more on that front to enable more competitive markets to function along those in those areas and along those lines. Let me hand it over to Smita to maybe take some of the other aspects of this.
Thanks, Siddhartha. So in terms of e-commerce, for example, when we wrote the 2018 Digital Economy Report, we saw that there's a high degree of digital literacy in Malaysia, but businesses actually adopt, fewer businesses than we would expect actually adopt digital platforms. But over the years, over the last couple of years, we have seen an increase in the use of digital payments, in the use of digital transactions. So one must acknowledge the fact that there have been major improvements. In fact, there's been something to the tune of, in terms of just transactions in 2018, 2019 alone, there was a huge increase. But having said that, there are a few issues that still remain, especially in terms of skills. When we're looking at digital entrepreneurs, for example, one of the things that did come out was while managerial skills suffice in Malaysia, digital skills in terms of coding are still below what we would expect a country like Malaysia to have. A recent analysis we did using LinkedIn data as a proxy, we saw that Malaysia actually fared well in some, but in some other aspects of technical digital skills, it lagged behind its ASEAN peers. So I would say, and this was done in light of Industry 4.0 and the need for digitization, which Serena actually alluded to. So the COVID-19 actually comes over and above already an increased, a world of increased digitization. So these skills actually become even more important. It doesn't become a medium-term issue now. It becomes a short-term issue that needs to be addressed going forward.
So I will add on to that, like the skills discussion, absolutely key. And I think now there's no denying it. Before, perhaps people say, we have time. Now I think it is forefront on all of management, on leadership's agenda. And what we're also seeing now, and where it's in the step in the right direction, is the fact that large corporates are also embracing this. And so from a skilling standpoint, they're not just starting to think about skills from their own, but it is, how do I also help skill my customer base? So what you're starting to see is everyone from telcos to banks to airlines even saying, hey, I'm going to step in and also help to develop skills of SMEs. And so in case we missed it, because the announcement was just before MCO, AirAsia, for example, as part of their skilling agenda, they've launched Red Beat Academy, which is all about skilling. And so it's not just skilling their employees that will need to go through change, but eventually they've also started to say, hey, SMEs, come on board, we will help train you, skill you. We see that with the telcos as well. So for example, we just announced last week partnership with DG to help provide skills training, so training, digitalization training with SMEs. And you see that with on the bank side as well. Because again, it's all about how do we scale at scale. Wow, that's like a tongue twister. Scale. So yeah.
Sure. Smita, in light of the rapid growth of e-commerce, what should be prioritized for governments and businesses?
Good question.
I guess I think going back to what we have alluded to, providing for governments to provide the basic infrastructure as well as a regulatory environment. It is going to be key to have an enabling regulatory environment for the private sector to actually thrive. And for the private sector to actually use this kind of wave to use it as an opportunity to acquire the skills, to reskill, to upskill, to be able to make sure that they're able to really reap the benefits that e-commerce actually has in store for them.
Sure, that's great. Now, should digital use case for technologies be private sector led or public sector led? What do you think, Smita?
Well, I think there is no one answer. I mean, the idea is there needs to be a synergy, right? And I think Siddharth mentioned it very nicely in his presentation. There is a very key role for the public sector in infrastructure provision. But in terms of the private sector plays an incredibly important role in being the user, but also in providing feedback so that the end result is something that is more demand driven. And maybe Siddharth can come in here with any additions.
Yeah, thanks, Smita. Just quickly to say that I agree. I think it's not an either or condition. I think there will be some use cases, especially public services, health, education, where the public sector has to play by default a very significant role and can be a big demand driver to mobilize and get things to be digitized as well. But then the private sector will innovate. It'll deliver the services that it delivers, better financial services, etc. And so there's obviously a mix of those two that will need to play out. I think in the end, it's about the partnerships between the public and private sector and recognizing that in this new reality, there's going to be a role for everyone to play, and we really need to come together to deliver better connectivity, better services, better skills, so that more people can benefit from this. Just echoing as Smita put it very well a few minutes ago.
Sure. We're running a bit out of time, so maybe this will be the second last question. So on e-commerce ecosystem, this is actually a question from the floor by MK Chong. So on e-commerce ecosystem, World Bank already has an excellent World Bank PPP guide and training certification on infrastructure, public-private partnerships. Now, will World Bank be extracting the same PPP guide to apply a similar governance infrastructure for e-commerce ecosystems? Siddhartha, do you want to respond to that?
That's a pretty specific question. I think we'll have to. It's an interesting point, and first of all, thanks for appreciating the work that the bank has done in the past. It's very nice to hear. But just to say that certainly we are trying to figure out, just given the evolution and rapid pace of change in terms of the e-commerce ecosystem, and of course with ongoing developments, we're going to have to think of the innovative models that not only help, as Ganesh you mentioned, not only help with the digital aspects of innovation in this space, but also with the analog aspects, which are going to in some ways be a longer term and in some ways more complicated thing to figure out. So public-private partnerships is certainly one way to look at it. but it's also almost a digital analog balance that needs to be figured out. So maybe we also do a DAB as opposed to a PPP on its own.
Yeah, so the other thing, Siddhartha, is the fact that because there are no physical boundaries in e-commerce, we do need globally well-structured PPP initiatives, right? Because if Malaysia does something different from Singapore and Indonesia, and when we start selling cross-border, it may affect those transactions. And maybe Smita can help respond to that.
I think I'd like to come in here because I think the emphasis here is on dialogue. It's not on, infrastructure partnerships in terms of physical infrastructure. I think we need to make that it's on having that dialogue between the private sector and the public sector, and not having a very clear kind of framework that needs to be implemented. And Malaysia is doing it very well, as Surina pointed out, right at the level of the ESC, what is happening in terms of providing real-time inputs. DOSM is conducting surveys to get a sense of how SMEs and how firms are actually surviving this crisis. That's the kind of private sector feedback that we're referring to. Pemuda does this very nicely in terms of looking at regulatory business environment issues. So these are the things that we are looking at in terms of facilitative dialogue, not traditional PPP that we normally used to talk about. So just to clarify. But
I want to emphasize that some more because Smita made a really important point, and this is relevant not just to government but companies itself. It's really important to get real-time feedback from your customers even. And so certainly this is a case that you've seen this all around surveys, people get information and then they iterate. And so if you're government, you need to do that. If you're a business, you need to do that. If you're a parent, even, you need to do that with your kids to get feedback to see what's working, what's not working. So real-time feedback and iteration is key.
Sure, that's great. Any parting words of wisdom, Siddhartha?
So I think this has been a great conversation. Thanks for having me. I think just the thing I'd like to say is certainly we know that this event, global event, is going to accelerate the pace of digitization for everyone. And what I would like to leave everyone with is, while there are 100 ways to think of how we can make that digitization happen faster and respond, to not forget those who are at risk of being excluded, and to really make sure that that as we digitize, we don't somehow leave people falling through the net, and we try to get everyone somehow to the same level there. Thank you.
Sure. What about Smita?
Thanks, Ganesh. I think my last point would be that now is the time, like no other, to actually use this as an opportunity to jumpstart and expedite the reforms that Malaysia has already embarked on, making sure that it is able to be inclusive, as Siddharth alluded to, but also able to reap the actual benefits of that digitization aims to bring with it for the economy as a whole. And
Surina?
So I will end by saying that as we continue to move forth, we talked about inclusivity, we talked about dialogue. Ultimately, what that is about driving impact at scale. And the way to do that really is to collaborate. And so, Ganesh, you've seen, I like to use the hashtag, let's build together. So in this case, in the new world, post-COVID, let's build together.
Sure, that's great, Surina. So we're living in unprecedented and exciting times. And it's actually an opportunity for us to now accelerate the digital economy, because I think one of the biggest challenges facing the digital economy was changing the mindset of the people. And with COVID, that has changed now. So the mindset of the people now, they're open to digital, they're more open to using digital. And so it's an opportunity for us to accelerate, of course, through dialogue between the public and private sector. Malaysia has many platforms for that. The Economic Action Council, Pemuda, as Smita said. And I think it's all about, as Surina also said, it's about testing and reiterating and actually finding the right formula now in a much more quicker pace than ever before. So I think with that, we're running a bit of time. There are actually a number of other questions that we have not been able to respond because of the limited time that we have. I believe that the panelists will respond to those questions through MDEC, and all questions, we'll try to answer to all those questions offline. With that, thank you, everybody. It was indeed an excellent session, and let's continue more dialogue like this, Serena, between the public, private, and also international sector as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot. Everyone stay safe.
Bye-bye.